So we've got some insight into Final Fantasy's future going forward through one of Square Enix's most recognizable figures, Mr. Naoki Yoshida. There was an anime expo this week where they did interview Yoshi-P, the head of Creative Studio 3, on how he thinks the series will progress in the future. There has been a lot of talk recently with what people would like to see with the series going forward, especially when you're talking about just Final Fantasy 17. And I think Yoshi-P gives a really insightful perspective as to why people shouldn't just be talking about the gameplay itself, why it shouldn't be the sole point of conversation here. So as always, do not forget to like the video and subscribe to keep up to date with anything JRPG or gaming related in the future. And with that, let's get right into it. So I'm just gonna get right into it because I think the interviewer here asks a really good question that I think is really relevant to Final Fantasy, especially now. And I think it's because of this specific game that has arrived this year that a lot of people have been really debating where Final Fantasy should go in the next entry. The question reads, quote, "There's a game called Clair Obscur Expedition 33 that has a lot of critical acclaim and successful sales. One of the things that stood out about the game was its turn-based combat. Expedition 33 was inspired by games like Final Fantasy and Persona. I know that you said in the past that Final Fantasy 16's more action-based combat was sort of a natural progression or a way to keep up with modern gaming. But with the success of Expedition 33, do you think that possibly mainline games could go back to being turn-based? As that seems to be something that players have an appetite for." To which Yoshi-P replies, "With this question of turn-based versus action, it tends to isolate the gameplay to just the battle system. That doesn't take into account what kind of game the creators want to deliver to players. For example, based on certain graphical quality we want to present to our players, or the narrative we want to deliver to our players, it relates to how we set up the game systems around it. This includes the battle system, game design, and gameplay feel. It's not a clear-cut answer whether it will become all turn-based or if it's going to become more action-based. I'm not necessarily going to be on Final Fantasy 17, so we also don't want to obstruct or limit our future director or whomever will be producing the games like 17 or even 18. We don't want to put them on a rail." And honestly, I really like Yoshi-P's answer here. I think it's what a lot of people need to hear because, yeah, the conversation does end up being isolated to just the gameplay and solely just the gameplay, to where people think that if the gameplay is a certain thing like turn-based or action, that everything will be better, which is just not the case. And I've been guilty of feeding into the debates of action versus turn-based and what the series should probably adopt moving forward, and there's definitely nothing wrong with that conversation, but I think there's so much to be said about everything else that surrounds the combat of these games that gives it that extra charm and magic, and I think it just speaks to way more than just a change in combat, but again, everything else that surrounds it, like for instance, RPG systems, playable party members, the world exploration, enemy and boss encounters. All of that goes into the process of deciding, okay, what type of combat do we want for our vision for the game that we want to create? And going beyond just game systems, sometimes it is just the project's budget that influences what type of combat they go for, and really just the game design in general when you're talking about the system surrounding the combat especially. Final Fantasy has kind of had this problem for a while now, to where they're so scared to go back to turn-based because of the budget, because these games just cost so much now. Obviously there are exceptions, but most turn-based games do not make millions upon millions to cover a Final Fantasy budget, which is why, you know, Final Fantasy as a franchise just has been shying away from turn-based for, you know, since 10, right? So yeah, I mean, besides the creative direction when it comes to these projects, when you're talking about game design, the budget of these projects really do influence what type of gameplay, what type of combat and game design these type of games will have. And unfortunately, sometimes it is just at the expense of creative freedom and trying to please, you know, shareholders, higher ups, you know, all of the people who really just are looking for the quick buck. But to go back to Yoshi-P's points about not really isolating the conversation to just being about the combat, but around the systems itself. I mean, just think of it this way, and this could definitely apply to Final Fantasy 15, but especially 16. Just imagine if there was more emphasis on RPG elements to where you could actually play as other party members. I mean, if there was party members in the game, right? And exploration was just more akin to something like your classic JRPG, where it was more, you know, globe-trotting and overworld map than something like open zones, really just empty exploration to get to one point to another. But just imagine how much more people would have probably enjoyed 16, even despite it going for a very heavy action style combat system, right? I am so confident in saying that 16 wouldn't have been nearly as divisive as it was. But admittedly, as someone who really enjoys 16, the reason why that game is so divisive is because it neglects a lot of the roots of Final Fantasy in its gameplay, especially when you're talking about just basic RPG systems and even playable party members, and it just does away with all of that, right? And so it really comes to no surprise as to why a lot of fans can feel very mixed on 16, even though it is a good game. And I think it speaks to a larger problem within the Final Fantasy franchise, that there isn't that one person who's the overseer for all of these projects, right? Who can organize all of these games and put them where they need to be, maintaining consistency and quality all around, which is something we really haven't seen since Hironobu Sakaguchi, which is crazy. And I think that is something that Final Fantasy as a franchise desperately needs. Something I also want to talk about is how Yoshi-P kind of chooses his words very carefully here, like he does with a lot of his interviews. But it's during these last few sentences where he says, "I'm not necessarily going to be on Final Fantasy 17. And to me, this just screams very classic Yoshi-P, especially during interviews, because he loves to play with words and very purposefully chooses his words carefully. Now, yeah, maybe it is a stretch to go off of his wording here, maybe it's not, but I'm going to go off of a whim and just say that it is Creative Studio 3 working on Final Fantasy 17, but probably just not having Yoshi-P direct or produce this game, as he is very busy with Final Fantasy 14. And before anybody says like, oh, that's impossible, you have to have Yoshi-P on the project, right? No, not necessarily. I've said this in previous videos, but Creative Studio 3 is a smaller team than someone like Creative Studio 1, who works on the remakes and Kingdom Hearts, but they are extremely efficient. They can definitely have multiple projects in development at once, as well as now with Final Fantasy Tactics: The Ivalice Chronicles. And this Tactics remaster does not have Yoshi-P directly on the project. Instead, you have other very talented developers who are taking up this project, like Kazutoyo Maehiro, who previously wrote for Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward and Final Fantasy XVI, and he's now directing the Tactics remaster, which is great, and it very much fits with what he works on. Of course, if you didn't know this already, it wasn't even Yoshi-P who directed Final Fantasy XVI, it was Hiroshi Takai, a very experienced game developer who's worked on games like Final Fantasy V, The Last Remnant, and of course, Final Fantasy XIV. Of course, Yoshi-P was still pretty heavily involved in 16, and he was very much the spokesperson for 16, but he was probably not making a lot of the big shots in development. So it's like Creative Studio 3 is more than capable of creating games without the oversight of Yoshi-P. Obviously, he is the head of the studio, but like, hey, if Final Fantasy 17 doesn't have Yoshi-P directly involved with it, that's completely fine, but it's still going to be Creative Studio 3 who can improve on their work with Final Fantasy 16, and maybe with that we can see some more consistency from 16 to 17, right? And just have them build and improve on their formula that would honestly do so much good for the series right now. And it's something that I've stressed in a lot of my videos numerous times, and you know, yes, it would be great to have these teams, have the same team work on Final Fantasy for a couple games before handing it off to another. Or again, like I mentioned previously, just have someone in the big chair, someone who can actually organize Final Fantasy, someone who can steer the ship, just like Hironobu Sakaguchi did all those years before. Anyways, tell me what you guys think about this down below. Do you agree with what Yoshi-P is saying here, in that, like, there should be more conversation about, you know, the systems around the combat, the game design of Final Fantasy, the globe trotting, you know, the RPG systems, what makes Final Fantasy beyond just, you know, turn-based and action, right? And how do you feel about the prospect of Creative Studio 3 possibly making yet another mainline entry right after 16 in Final Fantasy 17? To be able to both improve and evolve things that both didn't work and worked with Final Fantasy 16, do things that other teams just don't get the chance to do with Final Fantasy. Let me know all of that and more down below, and with all of that said, I will catch you guys in the next one.